Now when we look at mean and median, we're finding those values through quantitative data. So let's look at a couple of graphs. We've already looked at qualitative graphs. That would be the bar and the pie, the quality. So now let's go ahead and look at the quantitative. And one typical type is called a frequency plot, otherwise sometimes known as a line plot. And if you see below here, there's a line. And if I was measuring or counting, my data by collecting was the number of children we had, what we do here is either put a dot or an X, and for example, I have 3, so I put a little X there. Now, when you construct these, this would mean that somebody had 4, maybe 2 of us had 4. We can't go put a big, large X if somebody was to have 2 children. We would have to keep the X's the same size and stack them on top of each other. So again, we might put these here. And like I said earlier, maybe it wouldn't be an X. Sometimes they call it a dot plot because they use dots to represent. So this would look like 4 people had 1 children. And notice this data here. If we're looking at this kind of data, we would also call this discrete, which means that it is countable. I can count. If I was to measure something, that's awfully hard to count because there's smaller and smaller units. So it's something I just go out and count. Histogram is also used for quantitative data, but it's used for large sets. And often those large sets are going to be continuous. The class width, again, just like in the bar, they need to be equal. And we need to make sure that there's enough little categories here that we get everyone. And I shouldn't probably use the word category, but there's enough bins. I always look at it as these little bins. And maybe it's drill bits from Jordan. I'm starting to throw them in based upon their length. And as I throw them in, they pile up. A frequency table is just that. It's going to be a table based upon the number of times a value lands in a class. So we'll do one of these so you can see what I mean here. And the modal class is a class that occurs the most often. Again, you see that word mode. Most often. That would have the greatest frequency. And frequency just means the number of times it occurs. So here's some data about 20 students, and we're looking at their GPA. And we're going to put them into 4 classes. So we might go a GPA from 0 to a 1.0, 1.0 to a 2.0, a 2.0 to a 3.0, and a 3.0 to a 4.0. Notice there's nothing beyond a 4.0, and I've got everybody included. So we're going to go from a 0 to a 1. Now the bracket means if you have a 1, you will land in that class. And then we'll go from a 1 to a 2. So if you have a 1.1, you would land in the second class. We'll go from a 2 to a 3. Notice the parenthesis, a 2 lands in his class above it, and then a 3 to a 4. So if you're a 3.0 student, you would be in the 3rd class. So then all we do is tally and find out how many land in each of these. So this 0.8 or 8/10 lands in the 1st class. 1 4/10 or 1.4, usually when it's a GPA, we'll say I have a 1.4 GPA. And a 2.9, it lands here because it's not quite a 3. 2.7, but as soon as I get to a 3.2, it jumps to the next class. So as I go through and tally these, notice that when I get a 5, I do a crosshatch. It's just easier to count that way. I believe you get 10 in the 3.2 to 4.0, and then 6, 3, and 1. So if I was to shade this in, what would it look like? Well, in the 1st class, I have a 1, so I'm only going to go up 1 bar. In the next class, I have 3, and then I have 6, and then the last class, I have 10. Now, there's one problem with this. What do you notice about this top bar? It needs to be the same size for that grid line, so really it needs to be enlarged. So you need to be really careful that you have those enlarged. So that's how you make a frequency table. And that was used off of data. So those are 2 ways: frequency plot, and then we use a frequency table to come up with a histogram. Histograms are usually used for continuous or measurable data, in which we have decimal values attached to them. And that's it for Chapter 7, Section 1.